If you asked someone on the street in London where the British people came from, you would get a pretty simple answer. They have always been here. Maybe the Romans visited, the Vikings raided a bit. But the core British population has been on that island for thousands of years. That story is wrong. Over the last decade, scientists have extracted DNA from hundreds of ancient skeletons buried across Britain, and what those bones revealed has rewritten everything. Britain's population was replaced not once, not twice, but at least 4 separate times. It starts with a skeleton found inside a cave in 1903. Workers digging a drainage channel in Gough's Cave near the village of Cheddar in Somerset, southwest England, uncovered a nearly complete human skeleton buried deep in the limestone. They named him Cheddar Man. Radiocarbon dating later confirmed he died roughly 10,000 years ago, during the Mesolithic period, the middle of the Stone Age. He was about 5'5", in decent health, and he died in his early 20s. Nobody knows exactly how he died, but his body ended up deep inside the cave, possibly placed there as part of a Mesolithic burial ritual. For over a century, every museum reconstruction of his face depicted him the same way. Pale white skin, light features, the kind of face you would expect from someone they called the First Englishman. Then in 2018, a team at the Natural History Museum in London drilled a tiny hole into the petrous bone at the base of his skull, one of the densest bones in the human body and the best place to find preserved ancient DNA. They extracted his full genome. The results caught everyone off guard. Cheddar Man most likely had dark brown to black skin, blue-green eyes, and dark curly hair. Professor Ian Barnes, the geneticist who led the project, said he expected it would be a big surprise to the public. He belonged to a population scientists call the Western hunter-gatherers, and similar dark-skinned, blue-eyed individuals have been found buried at sites in Spain, Hungary, and Luxembourg. It turns out that fair skin in Europe is far more recent than anyone assumed. It did not become widespread until less than 6,000 years ago, when farming populations who needed more vitamin D from sunlight gradually evolved lighter pigmentation. Today, about 10% of white British ancestry can be traced back to this ancient hunter-gatherer population. But that connection does not run through Cheddar Man's British descendants. It came later, carried into the islands by waves of people from the continent. Which brings us to the first replacement. Around 4000 BC, farmers who had originally set out from Anatolia in modern-day Turkey arrived in Britain. They had traveled an extraordinary route, moving along the Mediterranean coast to Iberia, what is now Spain and Portugal, then north through France, and finally crossing into Britain from the west. DNA from their skeletons shows they had lighter skin than the hunter-gatherers, brown eyes, and dark hair, and they brought something the hunter-gatherers never had. Agriculture, pottery, domesticated animals, and the tradition of building massive stone monuments. These were the people who built Stonehenge. However, when scientists compared their DNA to the hunter-gatherers who lived in Britain before them, they found almost no mixing at all. The original inhabitants of Britain left virtually no genetic trace in this new farming population. The hunter-gatherers were not absorbed, they were replaced. For the next 1,600 years, these Neolithic farmers thrived. They raised cattle, grew grain, and hauled enormous stones across the landscape to build the monuments that still stand today. But around 2400 BC, everything changed again. A group known as the Bell Beaker people crossed the North Sea into Britain. In 2018, an international team led by geneticist David Reich at Harvard published the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted at that time, analyzing over 400 prehistoric skeletons from across Europe. The results for Britain were staggering. Within just a few hundred years of the Beaker people's arrival, more than 90% of Britain's genetic ancestry had been replaced. The people who built Stonehenge were essentially gone. Professor Michael Parker Pearson at University College London suggested that Stonehenge itself may have been built as an attempt to forge unity among the Neolithic population in the face of imminent change. If so, it did not work. The great monument outlasted the people who raised its stones. The Beaker migrants brought bronze metalworking, copper daggers, distinctive bell-shaped drinking cups, and new burial customs. They also looked different. The Neolithic population had olive-brown skin, dark hair, and brown eyes. The Beaker arrivals carried genes for lighter skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair. For the first time in history, Britain's population began to look the way most people imagine ancient Britons today. So where did these Beaker people come from? For years, nobody was sure. But a study published in early 2025 by David Reich's team finally answered the question, and the answer surprised everyone. The Bell Beaker people originated in the waterlogged wetlands of the Rhine-Meuse River Delta in the present-day Netherlands. A group of hunter-gatherers had survived there for over 3,000 years after Neolithic farmers had taken over the rest of Europe, because the flooded landscape of rivers, marshes, and bogs was terrible for farming, but perfect for fishing and foraging. Over roughly 1,500 years, farmer women gradually married into these wetland communities, bringing pottery and grain with them. Then around 2,800 BC, steppe migrants from the east arrived and fused with this resilient Dutch population to form the Bell Beaker culture. That specific mix of genes then crossed the Channel and took over Britain. Reich himself admitted that before the study, the Netherlands seemed like the most boring place in the world for Bronze Age research. But the story does not stop with the Beaker people. In 2021, a massive genetic study analyzing 793 ancient genomes uncovered yet another migration that had been completely invisible to archaeologists. During the late Bronze Age, around 1000 BC, a large wave of people crossed from what is now France into southern Britain. These newcomers carried slightly more early European farmer ancestry than the existing Beaker-descended population, a subtle genetic difference, but enough for researchers to detect it in the data. By the Iron Age, this French-linked ancestry had become dominant across much of southern England. An entire wave of humanity had washed over the island and reshaped the population, and nobody had any idea it happened until DNA exposed it. If you are keeping count, that is 3 near-total population replacements in the space of about 3,000 years. Hunter-gatherers replaced by Anatolian farmers, farmers replaced by Bell Beaker migrants from the Netherlands, and then Beaker descendants partially replaced by a wave from France. And we have not even reached the Anglo-Saxons yet. After the Roman Empire pulled out of Britain in the early 400s AD, people from the northern Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, and southern Scandinavia began crossing the North Sea in large numbers. In 2022, the most detailed genetic study of this period ever conducted was published in Nature. Led by Joscha Gretzinger and Stefan Schiffels at the Max Planck Institute, the team analyzed ancient DNA from 460 medieval individuals, including 278 from England, sampled from 37 different burial sites dated between 200 AD and 1300 AD. The results settled a debate that had been going on for decades. In eastern England, the continental ancestry of these Anglo-Saxon migrants accounted for an average of 76% of the population's genetic makeup. This was not a small elite ruling over a native majority. This was a mass migration. Importantly, the study found roughly equal numbers of men and women among the migrants, which means this was not a military invasion. Entire families were moving. At the Anglo-Saxon cemetery at Buckland near Dover, researchers reconstructed a family tree spanning 4 generations, and pinpointed the moment when migrant and local families started having children together. Women with immigrant ancestry were more often buried with brooches and beads, while men of both backgrounds were buried with weapons equally, suggesting a complex social landscape where cultural identity did not always match genetic origin. One question that haunts all of these replacement events is how they happened so fast. Researchers have found traces of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, in ancient European remains dating to around 2800 BC, right before the Bell Beaker expansion. David Reich has suggested that island populations, like the Neolithic British, may have been especially vulnerable to diseases carried by newcomers from the continent. A weakened, declining population would have been far easier to replace. A similar pattern may have played out after the Roman withdrawal, when economic collapse and possible epidemics reduced the native British population just before the Anglo-Saxon arrivals. However, modern English people do not carry 76% Anglo-Saxon DNA today. The number has been diluted over the centuries. Present-day English people derive only about 40% of their ancestry from those early medieval continental migrants. Another 20 to 40% appears to come from France or Belgium, possibly linked to the Norman conquest of 1066 or to centuries of steady movement across the English Channel. The Welsh and Scottish carry even less Anglo-Saxon ancestry, around 30%, retaining more of the older Celtic genetic signature. So what does all of this mean? It means that the idea of an ancient, unchanging British population is a myth. Every major cultural shift in British history, from the arrival of farming to the construction of Stonehenge to the Bronze Age to the Anglo-Saxon period, was driven by massive waves of migration that physically replaced the people who came before. Professor Mark Thomas at University College London put it simply: the more we learn from ancient DNA, the more we see large-scale migration as the norm in prehistory. Britain is not the story of one people who have always been there. It is the story of many peoples arriving, thriving, and eventually being replaced by the next wave. The DNA of someone walking down a street in London today carries fragments of all of them: Mesolithic hunter-gatherers with dark skin and blue eyes, Anatolian farmers who raised the stones at Stonehenge, Dutch wetland foragers who crossed the North Sea with copper daggers, French Bronze Age migrants who left no trace except in their descendants' genes, Germanic Anglo-Saxons, Scandinavian Vikings, Norman conquerors from across the Channel, and the science is not finished. Genome. Keep coming. New extraction techniques are pulling readable DNA from bones that would have been useless just 10 years ago. The next chapter of this story is still being written. If this changed how you think about history, please subscribe. We cover stories like this every week.